the concept of excavation is associated with archaeology. And that's what most people think of when they think of archaeology. But that wasn't what was intended when the word was first used for industrial archaeology. So I'm dwelling on this because the originators of the idea of archaeology, industrial archaeology, meant archaeology, as I say, as it was previously defined, as the systematic description and study of physical remains from the past. This might include excavation, but it wasn't limited to things in the ground. Indeed, the field of industrial archaeology intended to focus on existing buildings and structures that survived from the glory days of the Industrial Revolution. Whether excavation was or was not important to the field caused confusion and disagreements from the start.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Steve Guerrero. I'm the Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation in Waltham. I'm really excited for tonight's talk. Thank you for coming out. You showing up is a great way to support the local museum, and we're really grateful for that. Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to this special place, this museum, the site of the Boston Manufacturing Company, where Francis Cabot Lowell, the Boston Associates, the brilliant machinists and mill girls who worked here, built the first modern company in America and the first modern factory in America. So we're in a special place. Tonight's speaker is Sara Wermiel, an independent scholar and affiliated with the Society for Industrial Archeology, Southern New England chapter. Sara has studied this topic for a long time, is, let's say, mission aligned with our museum's founder, Mike Folsom, who believed telling the story of workers, where they worked, what they did, the machines they used, the technology they innovated, was really important for us to know and can give us lessons to live wisely in the future. So this is why we're here, this is our mission. Without further ado, I'm really excited to welcome up Sara Wermiel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, greetings, everyone, and I'm really pleased to be here and to be speaking as part of this Mill Talk series. So I'm the long-serving treasurer of the Southern New England chapter of the Society for Industrial Archeology. And Bob Perry, who is the museum's executive director, has been wonderful in reaching out to our group to see if we can collaborate for the benefit of both organizations. And he expressed an interest in having talks that would look at industrial history through an industrial archaeology lens. And this sounded like a great idea, but I thought first it would be worthwhile to explain to people what industrial archaeology is. And since I'm a historian, my way of understanding what something is through its history, how it became what it is today. So my mission this evening is to try to define the field, beginning with its origins, and outline where the field stands today. But I also will suggest some ideas for its future. So the field of industrial archaeology is about 70 years old, and the American Association for the field, which is the Society for Industrial Archeology, turned 54 this year. So there have been a few conferences in the past that have dealt with the question of the future of the field, but nothing recently. So I think it's time to think about this. But to begin at the beginning. So according to most histories of the field, industrial archaeology began in England in the 1950s. Donald Dudley, the first director of a new adult education program at the University of Birmingham in England, and then a professor of Latin there, coined the term industrial archaeology. And a colleague of Dudley's at the university, Michael Ricks, wrote this, which is considered the first article about the field, in 1955. He noted that important remains from the heroic period of the Industrial Revolution, the factories, bridges, canals, mines, tunnels, and so on, were being neglected and destroyed. For Rix and like-minded people, these remains were significant monuments, equal to the castles and mansions that up to then were top of mind for recognition and preservation. It was logical that Rix would use the term industrial archaeology in his article for the Amateur Historian because it was part of a series of articles about archaeology. Neither of these men, Rix or Dudley, defined the term industrial archaeology. Dudley, being a scholar of ancient Rome and Roman Britain, was involved with archaeology and was interested in encouraging participation in it. And indeed, archaeology was popular in Britain as an amateur activity. There were many local archaeology societies. They would excavate sites like this Roman fort. However, Rix, who was an architectural historian, didn't contemplate excavation as being part of the field. In his article, he mentioned still standing historic sites of industry and transportation, like this, the first iron bridge, which he wanted to be appreciated and preserved. He used the term archaeology to mean, as defined in the Oxford English Dictionary of the time, the systematic description and study of antiquities. So that definition was updated to specify what was meant by antiquities. So it's the description and study, and then they say monuments, works of art, so forth from the ancient past. But the OED notes that this is an obsolete definition. Now, the definition says the study of past peoples, blah, 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 the systematic excavation and recording. So now the concept of excavation is associated with archaeology. And that's what most people think of when they think of archaeology. But that wasn't what was intended when the word was first used for industrial archaeology. So I'm dwelling on this because the originators of the idea of archaeology, industrial archaeology, meant archaeology, as I say, as it was previously defined, as the systematic description and study of physical remains from the past. This might include excavation, but it wasn't limited to things in the ground. Indeed, the field of industrial archaeology intended to focus on existing buildings and structures that survived from the glory days of the Industrial Revolution. Whether excavation was or was not important to the field caused confusion and disagreements from the start. Some traditional archaeologists objected to using the term archaeology to mean something besides excavation. Nevertheless, the Council for British Archaeology became involved with a project to record historic industrial sites. The first general survey of industrial sites in England was conducted by volunteers under the CBA, the Council for British Archaeology, for the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works. The first textbook on industrial archaeology grew out of this site's recording, and this was Kenneth Hudson's Industrial Archaeology, an Introduction, and it began as a handbook to be to help the amateur CBA surveyors document and preserve historic sites. And his objective was to inform the public about, quote, surviving memorials of our industrial past and encourage support for preservation. Now, he was criticized by the mainstream archaeologists, but he responded by saying that they were defining archaeology too narrowly. He wrote, industrial archaeology, quote, is the discovery, recording, and study of the physical remains of yesterday's industries and communications. Excavation wasn't required. Meanwhile, in England, an industrial monument survey continued through the 1970s, and sites were recorded for protection and listing, like this important site, the Cromford Mill. This is their equivalent of our Slater Mill, which I'll show you a picture of, but anyway, the first successful cotton spinning mill in the world. But even so significant a site as Cromford Mill was run down when the Arkwright Society bought the property in 1979 to preserve it. In Britain, as in the US, old industrial plants and structures were not appreciated, as Ricks wrote in 1955. To take a recent example, this important textile mill was abandoned and derelict for years. It was registered and rated a very important monument, but it's only recently been renovated and repurposed. It was to understand and recognize such resources and to try to save them that industrial archaeology came into being. So, to sum up this background, the field called industrial archaeology took its name and purposes from the special conditions of the place in which it originated. Great Britain was the home of the Industrial Revolution and endowed with historic industrial sites of international significance. It was also a place where the field of archaeology, as excavation, was established and a popular undertaking. Hence, in Britain, the term archaeology was one that might attract the public, not put them off. Even though excavation was not considered a necessary feature of the field of industrial archaeology, from the reading I've done to prepare this talk, my impression is that IA in Britain is still connected with mainstream archaeology, much more so than the field is in the US. So now, on to the US. So here, the field of industrial archaeology was established in 1971 at a conference at the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of History and Technology, which is now the National Museum of American History. A group was formed that was supposed to combine business history and history of technology. The name they chose for the subject matter of this new group was industrial archaeology. This name was pushed by Robert Vogel, curator of mechanical and civil engineering at the Smithsonian, who was familiar with the industrial archaeology movement in Britain. The group created the Society for Industrial Archeology, an organization to promote the field. Here, as in Britain, some criticized the use of the word archaeology for a new field, since excavation was not, as a critic wrote, a, quote, normal method of procuring data. Moreover, unlike in Britain, as I suggested, US archaeological societies were not involved with developing the field here, although people who identified as archaeologists were members of the SIA. Nevertheless, the group stuck with this name, industrial archaeology, and they spelled it without a second A. So you just have to be careful of that when you're talking about American industrial archaeology. We don't use the second A. So what did Americans think industrial archaeology was about? Fortunately, there's a good explanation from an early proponent of the field and founder of this museum, Michael Folsom. I found a paper by him in his records here at the museum titled, "What is Industrial Archaeology?" And so this is from his paper. He wrote that the field is both a subject and a method of study. So the subject is technology and economic forces that shape the modern world, with a particular focus on manufacturing and public works projects. And it's a method of study in that it's examining material evidence and recording them through various means. So written histories, photography, measured drawings, and so forth. So this is a question: what period is covered by this field? He felt, and I think most people feel, that it's the period of the Industrial Revolution, the 18th century through the 19th century, but he also allowed that it does go into the 20th century. And one of the primary purposes of industrial archaeology is preservation. So the centrality of material evidence to the field is what made it archaeology. Folsom explained that physical evidence could fill in what documentary sources left out. For example, about the operation of machinery, construction of engineering structures, and organization of manufacturing plants. Very importantly, he wrote that one of the primary purposes of industrial archaeology was preservation. He believed that understanding the past, especially the importance of industry in the making of the modern world, required retaining things from the past to inform and inspire future generations. So this is a mission statement from the Society for Industrial Archaeology website that captures these things. So it's to encourage the study, interpretation, of preservation of historically significant industrial sites, structures, and artifacts, and technology. The SIA came together quickly in 1971, partly because at the time there was already people involved with preserving and interpreting historic industrial sites in the US. For example, Slater Mill, considered the first purpose-built textile mill in the US, was initially saved and restored in the 1920s by a nonprofit group. Cornwell Iron Furnace was donated to Pennsylvania in the 1930s and operated as a museum. These are sites where the history of American industry is interpreted, but often the staff and researchers at the sites worked in isolation from each other. So this was something the SIA hoped to correct, to bring people from these various sites together in contact with each other. Other activities that we would consider industrial archaeology predating the SIA included some regional surveys of historic industrial sites, like this survey of New England textile mills from the late 1960s. So this was the first survey that was done by the Historic American Building Survey of industrial sites. And the Smithsonian Institution, at the instigation of Robert Vogel, was the main sponsor for this survey. This is an example of the kind of recording work that was done by Habs. This is from the book that I just showed you the cover of. And the recordings included not only the places of production, but also, for example, at the Cheshire Mills Company, a boarding house, which was an essential element of their operation. Another regional survey, also sponsored by the Smithsonian, was the Mohawk-Hudson area survey. I just want to mention this because it was at the time of this survey that the Historic American Engineering Record came into being. So that's another program of the National Park Service to record. They're specifically charged with recording industrial and engineering structures, whereas HABS, the Historic American Building Survey, focused more on architecture. And so this is an example of a hair, as it's called, drawing. This is an early one from another survey of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad sites. A favorable zeitgeist in universities in the 1970s helped the field of industrial archaeology gain traction. Social history became the dominant history subfield in the US at the time. Many historians wrote about the impact of mechanization in the 19th century on the lives of workers, their families, and communities. So this was sexy and hot at the time. So in this fertile soil in the 1970s, industrial archaeology took root. The field of IA and the Society for Industrial Archaeology are different, but they're very close. The leaders of the field in the field of IA were also leaders in the Society for Industrial Archaeology. And it's reasonable to see the activities of the society as reflecting the development of the field. So in 1972, the SIA started a newsletter, and I showed you the first page in an earlier slide. The society held annual conferences. In 1975, it began publishing a scholarly journal, IA, the Journal of the Society for Industrial Archaeology. The journal has original articles on IA subjects and book reviews. Sometimes a journal had a theme, like these IA in art and New Bedford. Other themes have covered industrial waste, the Springfield Armory, and the West Point Foundry. In keeping with its purpose of promoting preservation of historic sites, the SIA members and SIA itself spread the idea of adapting and reusing former industrial buildings. Already in 1973, so this is way at the beginning, the SIA was awarded a grant to prepare a handbook on what was called adaptive use, which involved repurposing industrial buildings for contemporary needs, thereby allowing them to remain standing. The result of the grant was this book. Well, I have a copy if anyone's interested in seeing it. Working Places, the Adaptive Use of Industrial Buildings. The idea caught on, and over time, many historic properties, usually with the help of historic preservation tax credits, which also became available in the 1970s, have been rehabilitated and reused. Like this property around us, part of which is a museum and part of which is housing for senior citizens. And it's hard now to recall just how novel this idea was at the time. So regional chapters formed to allow people interested in the field to meet, because they're closer together. There are 2 chapters in New England, the northern and the southern New England chapters. The southern chapter was founded in 1976, the northern in 1980. And that year, the 2 chapters got together and began to put out a semi-annual newsletter together. So notice the masthead. At some point, a woman was added, which is important since a growing number of women were involved with the field. Anyone can join the SIA, and anyone can join a chapter. And in New England, chapters don't require members to be also members of the National Society, although we encourage it. So continuing with activities for the Society, tours are important for both the national and the regional chapters. Tours are part of SIA annual meetings. And in addition, there have been special tour events like fall tours and international tours. And notably, and I think this is peculiar to the US, we do something called process tours. So these are tours of operating plants. And ideally, they're like long-lived manufacturing plants, but people like to see anything. They like to see things moving. So, we'll see anything that's operating. And this is just to show you one example. This is Nipro in Clinton that makes medical plastic devices, little things out of plastic. And so we were able to see that site. Also in Clinton were a number of historic factories, so we saw those as well. I just want to show you a few sites. So this mill was not operating. This is a gorgeous mill in Dudley, which we toured, and that's our group. This was a tour of a number of sites in Worcester County, including one that the Draper textile machine plant not operating any longer. And then this was last year, a process tour of the Henry Perkins Company foundry in Bridgewater. So this, which is common, this plant, after over 100 years of operation, is now closing, and the site will be cleared and redeveloped. So now you might ask, what do people who are industrial archaeologists do? So here are just some occupations. This isn't everything, but they can work as consultants doing Section 106 work. I'll explain that briefly. Or surveys or National Register nominations. I know this is all sort of unfamiliar to some people. But basically, they're documenting historic structures, industrial sites, and also sometimes this involves archaeology of the mainstream sort of excavation. They teach, often in history and archaeology or historic preservation programs. They work for museums and historic sites, private, like this museum, or public, as in Lowell National Historical Park. And they can be cultural resource staff at engineering firms and public agencies. So I don't know if people want to know what Section 106 is, but it's just a requirement in the National Historic Preservation Act that properties that might be impacted by federally funded work, that it be documented in some way, to try to think in advance of avoiding that work. And that's the same with these cultural resource staff at engineering firms and public agencies. They might have an industrial archaeologist. Certainly the Mass DOT, Department of Transportation, has a cultural resource section because they have to take care of their historic bridges. They have to avoid harming historic resources when they do a highway or whatever. So there might be an industrial archaeologist on the staff in that situation. And then as far as survey work, communities and states may undertake surveys of IA types of properties and hire industrial archaeologists for this. And if a site is historically significant, it would pay to have an industrial archaeologist do the nomination for the National Register if that's wanted. University faculty might teach a course in IA. Museums and historic sites, that are concerned with the history of manufacturing and so on, might have an IA person to help them interpret the site and do research on the site and so forth. Okay. So I hope you now have an idea about what the field of archaeology is about and what the society that promotes it does. But now I want to talk about some of the challenges the field faces today. So one barometer of trouble is the drop in membership in the SIA. So according to a membership report, the number of members peaked in 2002 at 1,786 and declined steadily to 966 in 2016. And it stands at 718 today. So this is a problem for the society, but it's also a problem for the field. Not all people who are doing industrial archaeology are members of the society, but certainly this drop reflects a fall in interest in the field. So the question is why? And I'm going to propose some explanations, but this is completely conjecture. And I have to start by pointing out, as anyone who works with a volunteer group knows, it is really hard to keep things going. And it's really hard to find leaders. And it's just especially hard these days. So first, with respect to education, the field has had difficulty reaching students and scholars to interest them in working on IA types of questions or projects. Industrial archaeology never gained a foothold at universities. There's one collegiate program in IA in the US at Michigan Technological University, and faculty in various fields like history and so forth might offer a course in IA from time to time. In the past, there have been summer schools where they've worked on IA recording projects, but there's no organized support for the field in universities, and a lot of these education projects just aren't done anymore. Moreover, allied fields that deal with industrial history in some respect, like history of technology, economic history, business history, labor history, American studies, have just moved away from the period, of the Industrial Revolution, let's say, and from artifacts. These things just aren't popular anymore. Another thing that I think might be a factor is the professionalization of historic preservation. So on the one hand, this has created jobs for consultants. So, people trained in IA might do preservation work, surveys and nominations and so forth. But on the other hand, I think it might have reduced volunteer field surveys, which again used to be something that we did. But now, it's like there's professional people, so I don't know if that's the reason why, but it just isn't done so much anymore. So I think these factors have sort of taken the wind out of the sails of industrial archaeology in the US. Few opportunities to learn about or study industrial archaeology in universities, a decline in interest among students and academics in IA, professionalization of surveying, and as a practical matter, the completion of initial community-wide surveys. So, for example, when IA started in the 1970s, a lot of cities and towns just hadn't surveyed industrial sites at all. But in the 70s and 80s, many communities, for example, in Massachusetts, have done these initial surveys. So now there's some information about industrial sites, but I can tell you, it's not complete. The information is usually very scanty, and it can be wrong. So the fact that there is some record of these sites, doesn't mean there's no more work to do. So what next? How to revive the field and how to attract more people to it. I just have a few suggestions. First, the field needs a research agenda. What should we be studying? What sorts of questions do people want answered? What do we want to learn from the industrial past? I propose that a list of research questions be created, and this is something that was done for the field of history of technology long ago. And it's not that the questions should determine or constrain anyone. It's just that it helps to focus research, and it may attract students and scholars if they know what this is about, what these questions are. Second, there should be more attention to increasing IA education. Who's teaching courses now? What potential is there for more IA courses or summer schools? Can chapters offer more training and recording projects? Opportunities for members to learn and to go on and do their own research? I think only by increasing the number of people doing research in the field and developing new knowledge and ideas can the field be sustained. Thirdly, I suggest renaming the field industrial heritage rather than industrial archaeology. The name industrial heritage will be, I think, less confusing to people outside the field, and heritage still suggests a somewhat broader scope, I think, than archaeology. Some people think there's some writing which surprised me, but I read it. Uh, there's this, some people think that industrial heritage is actually a separate field, that there's industrial heritage and that deals with managing industrial sites, and industrial archaeology is research. But I don't agree with this. People use the terms interchangeably. So I think that it it would be fine to just, use this name, which people are already using. And in fact, the journal for the Society for Industrial Archaeology, which is going to get a reboot and has always been named IA for Industrial Archaeology, the Journal Society, it's going to be named Industrial Heritage. So I do worry that some people intend the term industrial heritage to signal a move away from physical remains. And tangible resources should continue to be central to the field. So that's not my intention. I don't think that should happen. But the study, description, and preservation of these physical objects should not be the end. Rather, the physical evidence is studied and preserved in service of answering questions about our world, about work and urban development and economic change. So here's a definition that I propose, which adds the rationale for studying and preserving these physical remains. So the study, interpretation, and preservation of historical industrial sites and structures and artifacts and technology as physical evidence for understanding the development of society and reminders of our past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to come around with the mic. Please wait till I get to you. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Thank you, Doctor. That was very, very interesting. I'm kind of amazed that that community colleges or local colleges such as Babson that has a strong business acumen, as well as an engineering school, don't latch on to courses developed along these lines as an elective at least. And I'm sure you've investigated that or thought of it, but it just boggles my mind that
Right.
that's not an easy elective for something like that.
Yeah, okay, so I hope everybody heard that. And I think somebody has to work at that. And that's what I'm proposing. I think, amongst the various committees in the Society for Industrial Archaeology, there's no committee on education. I think that somebody just has to work on that. And it's possible, as I say, I just know from students today, they're very interested in contemporary technology and things like that. I'm not sure, but students also like, they like stuff. So, to some extent. So, not everyone, but, I think it could be done, but someone would have to work at it.
I would just say optimistically, I have two Babson graduates in my family who both have MBAs, and when they heard I was coming to this tonight, they were pretty excited and wanted to hear more about
Well,
it.
I'm really glad.
Some taste of palate.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear that.
Howdy. Just kind of wondering. So you were using like the numbers of the members of the SIA and their declining rate since 2002, was it?
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
the peak according to this report. Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, like, just how that compares to people, historians, or widely stuff, because like that's also my sense in general for. I mean, I don't want to say for the field because SIA encompasses a couple of different disciplines, but just a lot of allied fields that encompass it have had a gradual decline, largely as funding and other supports have been kind of kicked out underneath. So,
Okay, so I hope people heard that. This is, are other fields, declining too, history fields, so forth. The, you know, as I think, I've just thought about this so much, like what to do. But in fact, industrial archaeology basically is an amateur field. So people in other fields that have, university programs, they get credit, so to speak, for being involved and doing service and so forth, you don't get a lot of credit for doing it in, I mean, you do it for love in industrial archaeology, really. So, I think that that's a bit of a disincentive. But but it's true, again, it's like the bowling alone, it's like everything. All sorts of, organizations are, losing members. So it's expected, but we have special challenges too.
How can we publicize and attract more people into the society?
Yeah, I see. The thing is we could. So the society itself is working on that. They want to increase members, and in fact, again, some people say we need young people. No, you don't need young people. It's like, this wave of people is turning 60, 65 every year. They're going to retire and they want something to do. And why wouldn't they join the SIA? So I think it's possible to increase those numbers, but they, in my experience, although they're, to keep the field going, they're not always the best. That if people who are actually doing scholarship in this area are the ones that will keep the field, new ideas and new research and all that. That's sort of, you need them for that. But for membership, yeah, the whole world is available for members.
So you suggested coming up with research topics that are promoted to organizing site for industrial archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, if someone asked you, what do you think would be the most interesting and impactful subjects of research to put on that list?
Well, do you just want a suggestion or? Okay. So something that I've been working on, and I just haven't had time to do it myself, but in the southeastern part of Massachusetts, there used to be an enormous iron production industry. There was more nail making and machinery and all kinds of things. So that's the Bridgewater, the Perkins Foundry. That was part of it, and this continued into the 19th century, although our region doesn't have coal and doesn't have iron. So I just find this very interesting, and the owners of these plants, these ironworks, they intermarried. It was a lot like the storied, textile, the Boston Associates. They invested in each other's plants and so forth. And this is just, a story and, that hasn't been written. Why did it persist? If you know Wareham, and Tremont Nail, I mean, that was, they were like the last cut nail company in America. When all the ones in Pennsylvania and everything like that were out of business, they were still making nails. It's kind of amazing. How did that happen and why? I just think it would be a really interesting story.
I found the sort of topic of presence in universities and awareness really interesting because, you showed some of these examples of the early starting field in Britain. And I just finished doing my master's in museums in Britain. And, I went to the Derby Museum of Making, where they're like, this is one of the first factories. Here's our museum of factories. And you know what? I never heard once in any of those university programs and any of those museums of industrial heritage the term industrial archaeology. And I think I would have really liked to know that term because I'm sure finding it interesting. But, I walked in being like, I wonder how you excavate when some of these sites are going to be contaminated and hazardous. And the answer is obviously it's not necessarily about excavation, but as this person that has just recently done university in sort of related fields, I have never seen it.
Well, yeah. So in fact, what's really weird is that in order to, because it's sort of associated with mainstream archaeology in Britain, they're now defining like, Iron Age sites as industrial archaeology, which was never the idea. But it's because it's become more strictly archaeological. But, as I showed you this West Point foundry, there's some places that really are archaeology. And so some people, some sites do need excavation. But in Britain, it's like to make it, to keep it going, they're sort of putting it in the archaeology direction rather than, as I say, what it was originally, which was sites, surviving sites. But I'm interested to hear that you never heard the term. How about that?
Hi, I thoroughly agree it should expand outside of industrial archaeology. I do think that the social history angle is wider and broader. And I know the word history alone, it doesn't have to be social, it could be industrial history, but I think the idea of having a larger umbrella that includes this would attract more people, business, but also historians, because I think history maybe is cooler now or archives to some. But I also wanted to ask, I saw in your background that you went to MIT, and I was curious what you studied and if they still have that program.
Yep. I studied history of technology, and they still have it.
So how is that overlaid with this?
Well, they're not interested in recording. They don't, yeah, I know, like, you can't believe it, but the way I see history of technology is that it's movable stuff, and industrial archaeology is immovable stuff. So that's like, and it's not exclusive, but that's basically how it breaks down.
I like the term industrial heritage very much.
Oh.
It seems that the physical fabric of buildings and artifacts that we talk about is in the middle of heritage. There's the innovation first, which is an intellectual process. And I'd like to hear your ideas about, if you're a preservationist, how one would capture the dynamism and the process of innovation. Then you have the physical fabric, and the other side of this is what we just talked about, which is social and financial impact. And it seems that this encompasses all of that. And if you own that whole domain, for example, what kinds of efforts of study and preservation do you think might capture the creative parts of invention and unmet needs that someone rises to fulfill with technology?
Well, again, the specialty of the field is how these surviving things, what they fill in, what you can learn because of the material remains. Because obviously you can learn a lot from documents and interviews and all kinds of things, but what do these help teach you? And I think so. For example, like Tremont Nail. I had no idea that there was such a widespread iron industry in southeastern Massachusetts. And so it was the site itself and its history that brought me into this. So I think that's what one is looking for. If you're starting from ideas and people and all that, there's a place for that. It's just that's not really what I see industrial, its special contribution. It really is tangible stuff. Now, the thing about preservation, I just want to say, is we lose a lot. We save buildings, but we lose a lot in sites when they're all cleaned up, when they're repurposed. And this is unfortunate, but that's how it is.
was going to ask if the situation in England or Germany or Italy, other industrial nations, do they have the same issue with declining membership? Or do they have industrial archaeological societies?
I know they do, and I don't know what their membership is like. As I say, in England, they've been taking it in all these different, trying to associate it with mainstream archaeology as a way of keeping it going, of bringing it, into the university. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, there are groups, and there's actually an international association of industrial heritage organizations.
I have one quick question.
Yeah.
Sitting here listening to you and archaeology and so forth, and that's digging history. It seems that the IA is looking for answers to the buildings you're looking at. And the buildings are telling you the history of what was there, and not so much digging or extending its life, but more of what we can learn from the building and the people who work there. Is that the way I'm interpreting?
Yes,
what you want to tell us, Sean?
that's right. So the contrast is that in traditional history, it was texts, and so a new source of data with industrial archaeology is the physical things. As I say, history of technology sort of got the movable stuff, and industrial archaeology got the immovable stuff, the bridges and the buildings and the canals and that sort of thing.
Thank you so much, Sara. So we're going to have some time as we break to see if you have any more questions as we go. I want to thank everybody for coming out. You being here is a positive sign. We're a museum of industrial history, and so as you can see, we are very closely aligned with what Sara is saying. It's really important to us, and it was important to our founder, Mike Folsom, that she talked about. And so keep supporting our museum by bringing people here, visit us, come to our events, engage with the SIA or Society for Industrial Heritage now.
Well, it still is. So.
Thank you very much. Have a good night. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.